The forgotten power of plants in ancient texts. You've read these names before. Hyssop. You've read these names before. Hyssop, frankincense, myrrh, mandrake. They appear throughout the Bible, quietly, almost casually, like background details you're not meant to question. But what if those plants weren't just symbolic? What if they were the real story? Because in the ancient world, plants weren't decoration. They were medicine, technology, survival. They treated infections before antibiotics existed. They preserved bodies before modern chemistry. They calmed the mind, reduced pain, and in some cases, altered perception itself. And yet, when we read the Bible today, most of that meaning is gone, reduced to metaphor, purification, blessing, anointing. But those words hide something much more practical, much more physical. Because when ancient texts repeat specific plants over and over again, it's not random, it's intentional. Hyssop appears in rituals of cleansing. Myrrh is used in burial and healing. Frankincense is burned in enclosed spaces, not just for symbolism, but for its effects. And then there are the more mysterious ones. Mandrake associated with fertility and possibly sedation. Wormwood, described as bitter, toxic, and powerful enough to contaminate water. These aren't just poetic references, they're functional clues. Because ancient societies didn't separate medicine, ritual, and spirituality the way we do today. To them, healing the body and influencing the mind were part of the same system. A plant could disinfect a wound and also represent purification. It could calm the nervous system and also be used in ritual. So when the Bible mentions these plants, it isn't just telling a story, it's preserving knowledge. But over time, that knowledge was simplified, translated into symbolism, filtered through culture. And once that happens, the original function starts to fade. What remains is meaning, not method. But if you reverse that process, if you look at these plants not as symbols, but as tools, the text starts to change. It becomes more grounded, more practical, almost instructional. So the question isn't just what these plants meant. The question is, what were they actually used for? And what did ancient people understand about them that we've forgotten? To understand why these plants matter, you have to understand the world they came from. Because in ancient times, there were no hospitals, no pharmacies, no synthetic medicine. Everything came from nature. Every treatment, every remedy, every attempt to heal the body or protect it depended on plants. And not just randomly. This knowledge was studied, refined, passed down through generations. In many cases, it was controlled. Priests, healers, and scribes weren't just religious figures. They were the keepers of medical knowledge. They understood which plants could clean wounds, which ones reduced inflammation, which ones could calm the mind or stimulate it, and which ones were dangerous, because the same plant that heals in small doses can harm in larger ones. So this wasn't simple herbalism. It was precise, practical, and in some ways advanced. Now think about how that connects to the Bible. When a plant is mentioned in a ritual, it's easy to assume it's symbolic. But in reality, it may have been chosen for a very specific reason. Hyssop wasn't just a symbol of cleansing. It likely had antimicrobial properties. Myrrh wasn't just associated with burial. It helped preserve tissue. Frankincense wasn't just burned for fragrance. It may have had calming or antiseptic effects in enclosed environments. These choices weren't random. They were functional. Because rituals in the ancient world often had dual purposes. Spiritual on the surface, practical underneath. And that's where modern interpretation sometimes misses the point. We separate religion and science. They didn't. To them, using a plant for healing and using it in a ritual was the same act, because both affected the body, both affected the mind, and both were part of survival. So when you read about plants in the Bible, you're not just reading symbolism. You're reading applied knowledge, encoded in narrative, preserved through repetition, and simplified over time, which means something important. If we only read these references as metaphors, we miss what they were actually doing. And once you start looking at these plants as tools instead of symbols, the text begins to reveal something deeper. Not just belief, but understanding. Some of the most repeated plants in the Bible have one thing in common. They heal, not symbolically, physically. Take hyssop. It appears in purification rituals, used to sprinkle water, to cleanse, to restore. But hyssop isn't just a ritual plant. Historically, it has antimicrobial properties. It's been used to clean wounds, support respiratory health, and act as a natural disinfectant. So when ancient texts described cleansing with hyssop, it wasn't just symbolic purification. It may have been literal sanitation. Now look at balm, often referred to as the balm of Gilead. It was famous in the ancient world, valued not just spiritually, but economically. Because it worked. It was used to treat wounds, reduce inflammation, and soothe damaged skin. It was rare, expensive, and highly sought after. That's not symbolism, that's medicine. Then there's aloe, mentioned in burial contexts. At first glance, that seems ceremonial. But aloe has preservative properties. It slows decay. It protects tissue. It was used alongside myrrh to prepare bodies, which means burial practices weren't just ritualistic. They were chemical, deliberate, practical. And when you put these together, a pattern emerges. Cleansing, healing, preservation. 3 core functions of early medicine, all represented through plants, all embedded in the text. Because in a world without modern science, survival depended on understanding how to work with nature. And that knowledge wasn't written as instruction manuals. It was embedded in stories, in rituals, in repeated actions that people would remember. So when hyssop is used again and again, when balm is described as valuable, when aloe appears in preparation of the body, it's not repetition for symbolism, it's reinforcement of knowledge. Use this, for this purpose, in this context, because it works. And over time, that knowledge became layered with meaning, spiritual meaning, cultural meaning. But underneath it, the function remained, which means the Bible isn't just referencing healing, it's documenting it. Some plants didn't just heal. They influenced, they changed the environment, the mood, the state of the mind. And 2 of the most important were frankincense and myrrh. You've heard their names before. They're famous as gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But that framing hides something, because these weren't symbolic offerings. They were extremely valuable substances. Frankincense is a resin. When burned, it produces a thick, aromatic smoke. But it's not just fragrance. It has measurable effects. It can calm the nervous system, reduce anxiety. And in enclosed spaces, it alters the atmosphere. Now imagine ancient temples, enclosed, dimly lit, filled with smoke. That's not just ritual. That's environment control. It creates focus, stillness, a shift in perception, which makes spiritual experiences more likely. Now look at myrrh, another resin, but with different properties. It's antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, used for wound treatment, and also for preservation. But here's where it gets interesting. Myrrh can also act as a mild sedative. It dulls pain. It slows sensation, which means in ancient times it wasn't just used in burial. It could have been used in treatment, in preparation, possibly even in controlled states during ritual. So when these substances appear in the Bible, they aren't just sacred, they're functional. They change how a person feels, how a space feels, how a body responds. And that gives them power. Not mystical power, practical power. Because if you can influence the mind, you influence experience. And if you combine that with ritual, you create something deeper, something that feels spiritual, but is also physiological, which means these plants weren't just part of belief systems. They were part of controlled environments, used intentionally, repeatedly, because they worked. And over time, that use became tradition, and that tradition became meaning. But underneath it, the function never disappeared. It was just reinterpreted. Not all plants heal. Some push the body further, into altered states, into danger, into something harder to control. And two of the most mysterious in the Bible are mandrake and wormwood. Start with mandrake. It appears in one of the strangest stories, associated with fertility, desire, and negotiation between two women. At first glance, it seems symbolic, but mandrake is a real plant, and it's powerful. Its roots contain compounds that can act as sedatives. In certain doses, it can induce drowsiness. In higher amounts, hallucinations, disorientation, even unconsciousness. In ancient times, it was used carefully, for pain relief, possibly in early forms of anesthesia. But it was also unpredictable, which gave it a reputation. A plant tied to life, fertility, and something deeper, something not fully understood. Now look at wormwood. It's described as bitter, extremely bitter. But more importantly, it's associated with poisoning. In some passages, it contaminates water, makes it undrinkable, brings suffering. That's not metaphor alone. Wormwood contains compounds that can be toxic in high concentrations. It affects the nervous system. It can cause confusion, convulsions, and in certain preparations, altered mental states. So when ancient texts mention wormwood, they're not just describing taste, they're describing effect. Real effect. And that matters, because it shows something important. Ancient people didn't just use plants for healing. They understood risk, dosage, impact. They knew that some plants could restore balance, and others could disrupt it completely. And that knowledge wasn't hidden. It was encoded, placed into stories, into warnings, into repeated references that preserved both the benefit and the danger, because survival depended on knowing the difference. Which means these plants weren't mystical by accident. They were powerful by nature, and that power was understood long before modern science gave it a name. Some plants weren't used on the body. They were used around it, to protect spaces, to preserve structures, to extend the life of what was built. And two of the most important were cedar and cypress. You see them in construction, temples, sacred objects. Even the Ark of the Covenant is associated with specific types of wood. That's not coincidence, because cedar especially has unique properties. It resists decay. It repels insects. It naturally prevents the growth of bacteria and fungi. In a world without chemical treatments, that's invaluable. It means structures last longer. Stored materials stay protected. Spaces remain cleaner. And then there's the scent. Cedar releases aromatic compounds that don't just smell distinct. They actively affect the environment. They purify air, reduce microbial presence, which means when cedar is used in temples or sacred spaces, it's not just aesthetic, it's functional. Now look at cypress, another durable wood, resistant to moisture, stable over time, used in construction where longevity matters, where exposure to the elements is constant. Together, these materials create something important: protection. Not spiritual protection alone, physical preservation, environmental control. Because if you build a sacred space, you don't just want it to look significant. You want it to endure. You want it to remain intact, clean, stable, and safe. So when the Bible specifies materials like cedar and cypress, it's not arbitrary, it's instruction. Use this material for this purpose, because it works. And once again, the pattern repeats. What appears symbolic has a practical foundation, because ancient builders weren't separating meaning from function. They were combining them. The material protected the structure, and the structure carried meaning, both at the same time. Which means even something as simple as wood choice was part of a larger system, one that prioritized survival, durability, and control over the environment, not just symbolism. Not all plants were used for healing or ritual. Some sustained entire civilizations. Olive, fig, wheat, these weren't optional. They were essential. Start with the olive. Olive oil wasn't just food, it was fuel. Used in lamps, used for cooking, used for skin, used for anointing. One plant, multiple functions. energy, nutrition, and preservation, all in one system. That's efficiency. Now look at figs. Dense in nutrients, easy to store when dried, reliable in harsh climates. They provided consistent energy in a world where food supply wasn't guaranteed. And then there's wheat, the foundation of diet, bread, storage, trade. Wheat allowed stability. It could be harvested, stored, and distributed. It supported population growth, urban development, economic systems. And here's what matters. These plants appear constantly in the Bible, not just as food, but as symbols of prosperity. Because in the ancient world, wealth wasn't abstract, it was agricultural. If you had olive oil, grain, and fruit, you had stability. If you lost them, you had collapse. So when these plants are mentioned, they aren't decorative. They're indicators of survival, of economy, of power. Because whoever controlled these resources controlled the system, which means these plants weren't just part of daily life. They were the foundation of it. When you step back and look at all of these plants together, a pattern emerges. They're not random, they're not just symbolic. They form a system. Healing plants, ritual plants, structural materials, economic foundations. Every category of survival is covered, which means the knowledge wasn't scattered, it was organized. And in the ancient world, that kind of knowledge was valuable, so it wasn't always written as direct instruction. It was encoded, embedded into stories, into rituals that people would repeat without fully questioning. Because repetition preserves knowledge, even when explanation fades. A priest performs a ritual using hyssop. A family uses oil in a specific way. A structure is built with a certain type of wood. Over time, the why can disappear. But the action remains, and that's how systems survive across generations. Now think about what that means. The Bible may not just be a spiritual text. It may also be a record. A compressed system of practical knowledge, preserved through narrative. Because if you wanted knowledge to last, you wouldn't rely on technical manuals. You'd embed it into something people never stop repeating. Something sacred. Something memorized. Something protected. And once that happens, the knowledge becomes part of culture, even if the original function is forgotten. Which means what we're reading today might not just be belief, it might be memory. So what did we actually lose? Not the plants. They're still here. Hyssop still grows. Frankincense is still harvested. Myrrh still exists. Olive trees still produce. But the way we understand them, that changed. Because somewhere along the way, function became symbol, use became meaning, and knowledge became interpretation. What was once practical became abstract. And once that shift happens, something important disappears. Not the information, but the application. Because ancient people didn't just believe in these plants, they depended on them for healing, for preservation, for protection, for survival. Every mention had context. Every use had purpose. But over time, those purposes were simplified, turned into metaphors, spiritualized, detached from the physical reality they originally served. And now, when we read about these plants, we see meaning, but we don't always see function. We see symbolism, and that system was powerful. It combined medicine, environment, psychology, and survival into one integrated understanding of the natural world. Not separate disciplines, one system. And that's what feels unfamiliar today, because we divide everything: science, religion, medicine. But in the ancient world, those lines didn't exist, which means the knowledge wasn't lost by accident. It was gradually reinterpreted, filtered, translated through different lenses over time, until what remained was easier to understand, but less complete. So the next time you see these plants mentioned, don't just ask what they symbolize. Ask what they did. Ask how they were used. Ask why they appear again and again across different contexts. Because once you start looking at them that way, the text changes. It becomes more grounded, more practical, more real. and maybe closer to what it was originally meant to be.